Okay, so trophic structure. Now let's look at feeding relationships in a community. There are three main models that we look at for this: food chains, food webs, and trophic pyramids. So now we're talking about like what eats what, right? So a food chain kind of is a link from producers, which are plants, all the way up to the top carnivores, the things that eat the things that eat the things that eat the plants, essentially. Primary producers make the food, right? Another term for those are autotrophs, and consumers are heterotrophs. Right? The primary consumers are the things that eat the plants. The secondary consumers are the things that eat the things that eat the plants. Tertiary are the things that eat the things that eat the things that eat the plants. And quaternary is the things that eat the things that eat the things that eat the things that eat the plants. Right? And arrows in these always mean energy transfer. So like whatever is being eaten, the arrow points towards the thing that is doing the eating because the energy is going in that direction. You can see here's a terrestrial example and a more marine example, which happens in the ocean. Food webs, though, look at all of the branching food chains that exist, like everything that eats everything within a community. Energy transfer is still indicated by the arrows. It's sometimes people think it's like, the fish eats the leopard seal, right? Because of the arrow, like, oh, that points to what it eats. That's not what's being shown here. The arrow is the transfer of energy. What they usually like to ask on the AP exam, for example, related to this, is like, what if I decrease the number of leopard seals due to overhunting for their blubber or something? And what's the effect going to be there? Well, you'd expect the fish, the things that eat the leopard seal, or not, the things that eat the leopard seal would struggle because they don't have a food source, right? So let's say these smaller toothed whales, right? They eat leopard seals. Well, if the leopard seals die, we'd expect the smaller toothed whales either to decrease in population size because they don't have as much food to eat, or they're going to decrease substantially these other things. The elephant seals may decrease in size. And if the elephant seals decrease in size, then maybe squid will increase in size. And the fish will increase in size due to, not size in terms of size, but population size, because there's nothing to eat it, right? And we're going to talk about those. Those are things that are called trophic cascades soon. So here it says decreasing sperm whales, right here. Decreasing sperm whales will likely cause an increase in squid because they're no longer eating the squid, because that's one of the squid's main predators. There are others, but maybe that means there's more squid for the elephant seal. So maybe the elephant seal will increase in number. So you just have to be able to kind of pick this information out and be able to figure out the effects that could happen most likely. An energy pyramid is a little bit different. So an energy pyramid looks at the actual total amount of energy that's available, and how it shows how each level there's less and less energy available as you move up, which is what limits the number of trophic levels we have. And trophic levels are these levels within eating relationships within a community. We are really limited to only 3, 4, maybe 5 of these levels beyond producers. Well, why is that? It's because eventually energy keeps getting lost at every level, right? So if we have the producers, which totally make up tons of energy through photosynthesis that's in a chemical form that can be transferred to the other levels, well, the plant uses about 90% of that energy to live. Only 10% of that energy is actually passed to the next level. So then that next level, what do? They use about 90% of that energy, and that only about 10% gets passed to the next level, and so on and so forth. This is called the rule of tens, which we're going to talk about in a second. This energy, remember, is lost to the environment eventually. Yeah, they do the work, they live, their cellular work's done, right? But eventually all energy in its least useful form is lost as heat to the environment. So here's showing you that rule of tens. Only 10% of energy is passed. They can, on the AP, they can ask questions related to this, related to, mathematical. What if we started with 14,000 kilocalories of energy, right? Then what's the next level going to have? Well, it's going to have about 1,400 because we drop it by about 90%. What's the next level going to have? Well, about 140. How about the level after that? Probably 14. Okay, and here you can see the simplified version with 10,000, 1,000, 110. but they can give you any value, and you have to kind of calculate that. Just always know that you drop 90% every single time, at least give or take. So here's showing you another example of that problem. If the producers in an ecosystem fix 20,000 kilojoules from the sun, approximately how many kilojoules of energy will be in the secondary consumer trophic level? It's about 200, because you have to go, so if you have producers is 20,000, you go up one, that's going to be about 2,000, and then the secondary consumer, that's about 200. If there's 5,600 kilocalories of total energy available in the primary consumer trophic level, and 750 kilocalories of total energy available in the secondary consumer trophic level, how efficient is this energy transfer? So now it's going to be around 10%, but it's not exactly 10%. So answer should be percent to the nearest tenth. That's how they'll ask you these questions. And if you do this calculation, 755 out of 5,600, it's 13.4% efficient, approximately. Well, not approximately, kind of exactly in this case. Okay. There's also species that have huge impacts on their communities, right? Things like that, and there's two ways that can happen. Either they have a huge impact because they are so abundant in the community. Like think about a forest. Well, there's tons of trees. Their biomass is insane, and they're very important for that community. They act as habitats, things like that. But there's also species that have a high impact if they're very small in number, simply because of the role that they play. The first one we're going to talk about are dominant species, which are what I just mentioned, right? They have tons of biomass, and because they have tons of biomass, they have exert powerful control over the currents and distribution of other species in that area. They act as habitat. They act as food. They produce, photosynthesis and oxygen and all these things. They're very important to that community as a whole due to their abundance. But a keystone species, and they love keystone species on the AP exam. Keystone species are low in biomass, but they exert massive control over the dynamics of the community. And if you mess with their numbers, or the numbers of individuals in that population, you really throw off the entire rest of the community. A sea otter is a great example of that. So they've done studies on this. So the sea otter, what it does is sea otters eat sea urchins. Okay, they'll actually swim down to the bottom, and it's really cute. They'll grab the sea urchin and a rock, and they'll smash the sea urchin on their stomach, and they'll eat the sea urchin and throw its remains away, right? But sea urchins eat sea kelp, okay? And sea kelp is kind of like the dominant species in this community. There's tons of it everywhere, and it acts like a forest, right? So everything lives around the sea kelp. It's very important. Well, what happens is that the otter actually keeps the sea kelp forest abundant to have a lot of it because it constantly is eating these sea anemones. Well, they did a study that, let's say, killer whales kind of moved into their territory, and they started eating the sea otters. So the sea otter, not a lot of them around, but they're very important for maintaining the kelp forest. The killer whale now kills the sea otters. So what's going to happen is there's going to be way more urchins. And if there's way more urchins, there's less kelp. And because there's less kelp, there's less areas for all the other species within that community to live. And this could cause complete community collapse. And you can see what happens here. Sea otter abundance, low. Otter abundance, high. But because we have a situation where the killer whale killed the otter numbers dropped substantially that caused a really high level of urchins. And here, the last level, you see the biomass of the sea kelp has dropped dramatically because of there's too many sea urchins. So the otter is considered to be the keystone species. Rare in number, but super important for that community. Okay. Top up and bottom down controls of populations. So this is kind of what we just talked about. In a bottom up model, when you mess with the bottom of a trophic pyramid, okay, if you destroy the plants in a community, everything else is affected above it, right? So if I have very few plants, I'm going to have less of the level above it. There's not going to be as much for them to eat, and thus not as much for the level above, and not enough for the level above, which, causes all of these trophic levels to decrease. That's in a bottom-up model. The same thing's true if we increase biomass. You'd expect everything else above it to increase. That is in contrast with a top-down model, which is also called a trophic cascade. And these are interesting. And this is kind of what we just saw with the sea otter, too. If you decrease the biomass of a level above, it's going to change the levels below it in an alternating pattern. So if the top predator decreases in number, that means the level below it will increase in number, which will eat more of the thing below it, so it'll decrease in number, which will cause less of the thing below that to be eaten, which causes that to increase in number. So it causes this kind of alternating cascade, as opposed to that bottom-up model, which causes everything to either increase or decrease. We're showing you kind of the examples of each of these. This is our original. We increase the producers, so we increase everything else above it. This showing us increasing the secondary consumer, which eats more of this primary consumer, which causes the producers to go up. And then we have adding a tertiary consumer, dropping secondary consumer, which causes primary consumers to increase, but they're eating too much plants, so that decreases over time. It's all like homeostasis. It's all like feedback mechanisms, just like inside of your cells, with these organisms being able to survive. All right, ecological succession. I just want to see something real quick. Okay. Ecological succession is the process by which we start with a blank slate community, nothing there, right? And we slowly over time develop that community into a complex community. So what I mean by that is like going from blank soil or rock to a forest, and how long that takes, right? The process of primary succession occurs when literally no soil exists and we have to create soil from scratch. Think rock, like a volcano comes out of the ocean, it's rock. Eventually that's going to turn into a complex community as long as it stays around long enough and it's large enough, like Hawaii, for example, right? It takes a long time to happen because you need to develop soil. That takes forever. You need pioneer species that can survive on almost nothing, like mosses can do that. They live on rocks. You've seen that before. They can get, they can get their nutrients from very little things, and they grow there. But then the moss dies, and it starts to accumulate soil due to the dead moss and the organisms that break the moss down there. Now we get layers of soil. More complex organisms can start moving in. More complex plants, they die. And then, then you get more soil, and eventually you get other species living on those plants and things like that. So it takes a lot of time for primary succession to become this complex community. And what's interesting about it is the species that existed and were dominant early on will die off. They will eventually be replaced by other species that are more complicated. So, for example, the dominant species early on are these pioneer species like mosses. Fast forward 1,000 years, and you probably have trees being the dominant species there. Very few mosses comparatively. Secondary succession is when we already have soil there. So soils, making soil takes a long time. So if we can skip that step, like let's say there's a huge disturbance, like my professor in college, Dr. Titus, he did work at Mount St. Helens after it exploded to see how long it took or erupted, how long it took for all of those species to come back over the course of time. The soil was there, right? But all of the species were completely wiped out due to the severe heat of the whole thing. And he showed how ecological succession slowly over time developed back into a complex community. Here's showing you primary succession, blank slate, those pioneer species giving way to more shrubby type things, and eventually into the complex community over time. And previously we talked about R and K selected species. R selected species tend to dominate in the earlier phases of ecological succession, and K selected species tend to dominate more towards the end of ecological succession. Okay, and here's showing you secondary succession. Remember, the only difference is we start with soil already, so this process happens much faster. But still, the steps are the same. You still have R selected species here, more K selected species here. All right. Now let's talk about human disturbance. Humans are the most widespread agents of disturbance, and I'm telling you that it's a complete understatement because of how much impact negatively that we are having on the world. As far as we know, based on all things we know about science, we are by far the most disturbing, well, we are the most destructive species to ever exist on this planet. We can manipulate our environment because of how large our brains are and how smart we are, and how we can create technology to manipulate our environment for our own needs. Human disturbance in general reduces species diversity. Destroying habitats reduces species diversity. And humans, even when they're trying to do good things, sometimes are causing problems. So they think they're doing something good, like stopping forest fires. That sounds like it's a great thing. But in actuality, when you stop forest fires for too long, it actually causes to have uncontrolled severe forest fires, which cause more damage than they would have previously. And I'll talk about those in a second. Okay, so invasive species. This is a problem. This is when we humans decide, oh, we're going to take a species from one place and bring it somewhere else because we want that species to do something, right? Not always purposefully, or sometimes people just stupidly do things like, I don't want this snake anymore. I'm just going to throw it out of the house and let it live. That snake doesn't belong there. Usually it relates invasive species specifically to species that evolved somewhere else, and we bring them into a new environment. Now, that new environment could be a place where that species just dies. It can't survive there, and that's fine in that case. But sometimes we bring them to places and they can survive, and they survive really, really well because they have some sort of advantage, and the other species that exist in that community have not evolved to deal with this organism yet. A great example of this is the lionfish. And the lionfish are found in the Great Barrier Reef, and they're kept in check by they have predators there. They have things that are able to kill it. But people take lionfish because they're beautiful looking. They are poisonous. They're beautiful looking. But they eat things like crazy. And they put them in their saltwater tanks because of how beautiful they are. Well, this is too big. I don't want it anymore. So they throw it in the ocean in Florida, right? These lionfish are pervasive everywhere down there. It is insane how many lionfish there are. And in fact, they're decreasing because we're preventing you're literally allowed to kill them if you go. Don't touch them because they'll poison you and can kill you. But you can kill them legally because they're an invasive species. And they eat food like crazy, and they're decimating coral reefs on top of the problems that coral reefs have due to coral bleaching. These things are messing with them too. Another one that's really cool is this Japanese knotweed. You'll see Japanese knotweed everywhere around the in riparian zones, places where they're close to, right around rivers and streams, and they grow like crazy, and they always come out a little bit too early. They're from Japan. We brought them here to prevent soil erosion. That's never a good idea, and they don't prevent soil erosion, actually. They just grow like crazy, and they use all the resources for other things. It always peaks out before the other plants in spring, and it grows up, and it shades everything else out, and nothing else can germinate and outcompete it. And it's very difficult to get rid of because it reproduces asexually. In fact, almost all of Japanese knotweed is a giant monoculture of asexually reproducing plants, and you'd have to chop up pieces to be smaller than an inch in diameter and width in order to stop them from spreading. So literally you can take a little chunk that's like this big and plant it, and new Japanese knotweed will grow there. Think about Mickey when he was destroying in Fantasia, that famous thing with his wizard hat. He's destroying those he thought it was a good thing, right? To make those brooms do his work for him. You know what I'm talking about? And then he gets all upset because it's out of control, and he starts destroying them, and then they just multiply after he tries to destroy them, and it causes more harm than it did in the first place. Kind of like an interesting tie-in to how invasive species work in general. Zebra mussels, you've heard of. They're cleaning out the lake. The lake's really clear because of it. But that's not good for all the species that live within the lake, and it decreases biodiversity. So invasive species are bad because they do not belong there, and they did not evolve there, and they throw off the ecosystem in general in lots of different ways. Okay, deforestation is bad because you're destroying the dominant species in a community, clearly. Their habitat loss is very serious. And obviously, because of that, it has a tremendous negative effect. I don't think I have to talk about that. And then I mentioned this, and this is going to be the last thing that we talk about here today, is that sometimes we try to do things that sound like they're great, but they're not. So Smokey the Bear, in this case, was not right. Do not prevent forest fires. So yeah, you don't want to like start a forest fire if it's really dry, but at the same time, these fires have been going on for millions and millions of years. They are important for the ecosystem. And in fact, there are certain species of plants where their seeds will only germinate after a fire has occurred. So it actually they have to heat the seeds up, and there's changes in the proteins that allow the seeds to germinate only after fires. Interestingly enough, if the fire burns too hot, it will destroy the seed too. So it needs a fire, but if the fire is too hot, it doesn't work. And that's what we're doing. We're actually destroying a lot of these mechanisms because they're supposed to happen. And the species have adapted to deal with forest fires in these areas, but not when they're that hot because we're preventing them. And when we prevent them, it causes these huge, massive fires that are much more severe. So, all right, that is all of community ecology. If you have any questions, let me know.